Good evening. I want to thank you all for coming out. And let me rush to thank Pastor Rob, the other pastors involved, Renaissance Church. I think I saw Steel City, Bellevue Church. Which one am I missing one? And Pursuit. And Pursuit. I want to thank them for the invitation. It is not lost on me that to have conversations about the intersection between faith and politics can be a very emotional and it can be something we have a lot of disagreements about. I mean, we've seen churches break up, we've seen people lose relationships, and so it's not lost on me that they've entrusted me with the opportunity to speak to you about that very fragile subject. And so I thank you to be entrusted with that, and don't take that lightly at all. So I do want all you to know that. Today I want to talk to you about our calling in a polarized age. Our calling in a polarized age. The American experiment, the workings of this constitutional republic is at, I would say, a most crucial juncture. Not only are we missing a common story and a common vision, we can watch the same occurrence from a very similar location and walk away with two very different recitations of the facts. Today, it seems that we force the facts to comply with our narratives rather than making sure our narratives comply with the facts. This is what we would call a crisis of epistemology, a crisis of intellectual humility, and a crisis of conscience. At times, there seems that there is nothing that's sacred and that objectivity is discouraged within our ideological tribes. We're in a situation where we see bad faith, bad blood, bitter rivalries litter our cultural and political landscape, limiting our ability or our willingness to do the hard work of democracy building, which is to set aside our petty hang-ups and naked self-interest to work together for something much greater than us as individuals, to discover what it means to share power and to respect opposing opinions. That's democracy. But it seems that we are more committed to the fight than the pursuit of the solutions. And as a consequence, our healthcare system keeps Americans sick and bankrupt. The poor can break their backs with 2 jobs and still can't afford housing. And some school children are taught the intricacies of sexuality, but never learn to read. And so I ask you today, church, what is our role in the public square? What is our calling in this moment? Is it simply to be the best Republican or Democrat or progressive or conservative that you can be? Or is there something more that we should be striving for? Today, I will suggest that we must be advocates, that we must be loving neighbors with intellectual humility, civility, and we must always be peacemakers who don't run from necessary tensions or conflict. Our public witness must be studied, clear, and confident, but never self-righteous. We must be willing to learn from others while maintaining our first principles, while maintaining moral imagination. Let's go to Scripture. If you have your Bibles, you can turn to Exodus chapter 1, verses 6 through 11. Exodus chapter 1, verses 6 through 11, and it reads, "Now Joseph and all his brothers and all that generation died, but the Israelites were exceedingly fruitful. They multiplied greatly, increased in number, and became so numerous that the land was filled with them. Then a new king, to whom Joseph meant nothing, came to power in Egypt. "Look," he said to his people, "the Israelites have become far too numerous for us. Come, we must deal shrewdly with them, or they will become even more numerous, and if war breaks out, we'll join our enemies, fight against us, and leave the country." So they put slave masters over them to oppress them with forced labor. And they built Pithom and Ramses as store cities for Pharaoh. If you don't mind, I'd like to start this conversation, so to speak, with a personal story. My father worked for the Denver Water Department for over 30 years. And when he was promoted from being a meter reader, the person who would literally come to your home, go on the back and read your water meter, when he was promoted to being in an office job, he was confronted with resistance. Not everyone was welcoming or excited about his new prospects. In fact, the lady training him seemed to be determined to make his transition as difficult as possible, to complicate things, to trip him up, as if to prove to him and to others that he didn't belong. And in one instance, when he politely questioned an inconsistency in her instruction, she became irate, screaming obscenities and questioning his intelligence. It quickly became clear that this was more than just a misunderstanding. Something deeper and more antagonistic was at play. The tirade would climax in a physical assault. Swinging an open hand, she would literally slap my father in his face while he sat at his cubicle. Stunned and disoriented, this man from the ghetto of West Side Chicago somehow found the self-restraint to walk away. After all, he had a young family that he had to feed. He would eventually collect himself and do what you're supposed to do by protocol, go to human resources. But they had already been tipped off. And predictably, the power structure had begun to systematically form around the perpetrator to protect its own. He was given a half-hearted hearing where a panel void of his peers gaslit him and suggested that he was ungrateful for the opportunity he had so generously been given. In other words, know your place. He would have no internal recourse. The policies in place to prevent such an indignity lacked effect because some in power lacked the integrity to administer justice. But when I think about it, don't we all have this tendency? I don't know that this is a progressive or conservative thing, but perhaps we're all inclined to choose partiality over just outcomes that would hold our kinsmen accountable. Anyway, silenced and indignant, he decided to go to the office of State Senator Regis Groff, a civil servant of the truest sense of the word. He recounted his story to the senator, and as my father's representative, Groff went to the office and he held those accountable, those in power, accountable for what they had done. Now, I'm certain that he had other things on his calendar that day. He could have spent his time calling donors and dining with power brokers. There were no cameras, no compensation, nor any awards of recognition involved. My father didn't have any big campaign contribution to offer. He had no political or social capital to barter. There was no influence to peddle, no quid pro quo to speak of. And it wasn't part of the senator's formal job description. But Senator Groff did it because it was right. Because he was a sworn representative of the people that had dedicated his life to advocating for the common man. And truth be told, I might not be standing here before you today if he hadn't taken the time to restore the sense of dignity in a man who had been mistreated and was silently struggling with alcoholism. A man wondering if he had what it took to be a good father. Trying to break a cycle of fatherlessness. Succeeding and failing, failing and succeeding to overcome the obstacles and temptations of the society around him. Facing struggles of his own making and those of an institutional origin. That advocate didn't just bless one man that day. He blessed an entire family for generations. My father would surrender to God and find victory over alcoholism. He would become the father he never knew he could be. And if we think about it, isn't that story a testament to the genius of democracy? Isn't that story an illustration of the brilliance of our constitutional republic? The idea that the smallest among us should have a voice and an advocate. The wisdom to understand that none of us, no individual, no group, are fit to lord over others without the checks and balances of equal representation. What an exceptional idea. In Exodus 1, we see what happens when a people is completely without a voice. When Joseph was alive, the Hebrew people were treated fairly, allowed to flourish and be fruitful. This is because those in authority recognized him and respected him. They recognized his contribution. Consequently, his people had an influential advocate. But when Joseph dies, and a new king to whom Joseph meant nothing steps in, the Hebrews become nothing more than a threat. Political abstractions, markers on a war room strategy map. From Pharaoh's perspective, the destinies of the Egyptians and the Hebrews were no longer tied together. In other words, the Hebrews were no longer seen as neighbors. And if we're honest, to some extent, isn't that how we treat our cultural and political opposition? Simply as people to be defeated and treated harshly. We pretend that the state or the nation would be nearly perfect if we could just get rid of all those conservatives or all those progressives. If we could just make them disappear, we could fix everything. But isn't that the same root of detachment? The same root of self-interest and contempt that the new king had introduced to his people? You see, we read Exodus, and we usually do so from the perspective of the Hebrews. But what I want to submit to you all today is that all of us have some Pharaoh in us. And the more that we ignore it, the more that we risk our power becoming our condemnation. The more our arrogance can turn us into exactly what we claim to be fighting against. I call this the tyrant impulse. It's the temptation in every group and in every movement to silence or erase others, to unduly prevent them from pursuing their cultural and political ends. It's the urge not to win the debate, but to summarily end the debate through intimidation or force. You see, the tyrant is usually thought of as an individual authoritarian, but it can also be a collective ideological tyrant, urging the state to do its bidding and to punish its enemies. Those acting under the tyrant impulse cannot tolerate political, social, or cultural disagreement. Our ideologies can be tyrannical when they convince us that we're so right that we shouldn't have to explain ourselves or endure opposition. The impulse is in all of us. The question is whether or not we will act on it. And those who don't deliberately extinguish the tyrant impulse in their camp rarely see themselves for what they've become, especially if they're upholding what they honestly deem to be a good cause. But I warn you, it's a misreading of history to say that what all tyrants have in common is an obviously malicious cause. It's not true. Surely some do, but that's not the common trait. Some tyrants have championed what was initially a good cause. What's common among tyrants is not equal malevolence of cause, but a willingness to violate the human dignity of others to achieve their objectives. A good cause does not justify you. The willingness to promote narratives that make other groups appear to lack value and to lack worth and to be unworthy of respect is what makes you a tyrant. A desire to crush the institutions that amplify the voice and the agency of others. Under the tyrant impulse, we can't simply say, you know what, you're wrong, let me show you why. We have to say you're irredeemable and that you have nothing to contribute in this space. Those who succumb to the tyrant impulse have fallen for the age-old error of becoming evil to fight evil. But Jesus commanded us to see the inalienable value even in those who devalue us. Notwithstanding Newton's third law, the gospel disallows the equal and opposite reaction of contempt and vengeance. The tyrant impulse relies on compulsion instead of persuasion. So it's obviously incompatible with democracy. But I would suggest that it's even more so in conflict with the gospel. Humility, respect, empathy, and intellectual honesty dismantle the tyrant impulse. In the public square, we must all decide whether we will be tyrants or neighbors and advocates. If it is possible, as far as it depends on you, live at peace with everyone. Romans 12:18. We ought to be peacemakers and to take that task seriously, while understanding that even peacemaking can involve disagreement and friction. You see, I would be doing you a disservice by giving you some flowery message and pretending that we can all just agree, sing kumbaya, and live happily ever after. That's not realistic. There will be necessary conflict and tension, when we have fundamental disagreements on life and death issues. As Christians, we cannot condone injustice or immorality to achieve some type of fraudulent peace. That's not what I'm advocating for. This is not an ode to moral relativism or some type of romantic false equivalence. All opinions are not equal. Some are very wrong and very dangerous. I can't tell you to silence your convictions on those issues. There are people who must be held accountable, movements that must vocally be opposed, and ideas that deserve a very public and democratic death. What I'm saying here is that even when in conflict, we still have to listen to others and refrain from trivializing their pain. One of the nastiest things we do in the public square is to trivialize the pain of our opposition because we don't want to give what they're saying any credibility. It's wrong. It is unchristian. The gospel, here's what the gospel does. The gospel allows us to be gracious and tenacious. Gracious and tenacious. My friend John Anazu calls this confident pluralism, which is standing on one's convictions, whether it be the sanctity of life or how we should treat the poor, amidst deep difference while living respectfully and peaceably. But it's hard to be respectful when we believe that our side has all the answers and the other side is responsible for all that is bad and evil. The people who keep you most enraged is because they've convinced you that this is simply a battle between good and evil. But if you read your Bible, you should know that you're not that good. We tend to overestimate our rightness and our righteousness outside of God. But the gospel gives us every reason to walk humbly in the public square, understanding that not all our opinions are faithful applications of the gospel. But some of our opinions are faulty conclusions, perverted by self-interest and blind spots. Now be sure there are issues the Bible addresses directly and clearly, and consequently, we can confront them with a level of certainty. But we can never confront them with self-righteous arrogance. Jesus continually chastises those who, like the praying Pharisee, exalt themselves and condemn others. As I read the Bible, I see no indication that God's own people ever had all the answers or had a monopoly on good ideas and good works. They were often blessed by the insights of outsiders and sickened by the fruit of their own understanding. God gave us the word, but he did not give any one group all the answers. We're broken. Our intellect is incomplete and can lead us to destruction. Even our concept of love can be distorted. Think about it. Love for our own throughout history has been treated as a justification for wickedness towards others. We must reckon with our partiality and fear what it could do to those under our influence, under our authority, who don't have an advocate in our lives, who we don't see as neighbors. We must get rid of the false and arrogant notion that we, or our ideological tribe, or our party are intellectual enough are altruistic enough to rule over others without their contribution. Over and over, history disproves that arrogant proposition. I'm not going to name any names, but there are some of us here today that come from an ideological tradition that opposed the civil rights movement. Others come from an ideological tradition that ushered in eugenics. Conservatism has yet to present us with a perfect meritocracy. Progressivism has yet to prove that by replacing God with autonomy, we can create a perfect utopia. What I'm saying is that neither of these ideologies have proof of concept. We seek near absolute power for one side. But the truth is, none of us are fit to steward it. Let us acknowledge that reality and be humble as we address our neighbors and seek solutions. Let us not compromise our intellectual honesty out of an eagerness to exalt ourselves and cast our opponents in the worst light possible. We cannot defend ideological conclusions at all costs and simultaneously seek what's good and true. If we are progressive or conservative on every single issue at all times, then we're not faithful. We're intellectually lazy. We've outsourced our public witness to someone else, and they decide what's right, and we follow behind them. The gospel challenges progressivism and conservatism. That's not our goal. Our goal is faithfulness. And there should be no one who we can't hear out to make sure that they have an advocate in our point of view, in our sphere of influence. From tax collectors to prostitutes and persecutors of the church, Jesus showed us that all kinds of people are redeemable, are worthy of our consideration, are capable of making a contribution. Just because someone disagrees with you on something you care dearly about, whether it's racial justice, whether it's abortion, they might be wrong on that issue. It does not mean they're wrong on every issue. And shame on us if we make that assumption. In conclusion, I would say that in order to be more faithful, in order to speak into this fractured society with good news, we must move from cynicism to moral imagination. Moral imagination is the ability to see not simply what has been historically, or what is in the moment, or what is likely to be. It's the ability to see what ought to be. It's hope in the midst of oppression, division, and vitriol. It's not a pipe dream. It's more like the Hebrew vision of the land promised, but yet to come. It's what convinced Frederick Douglass to learn to read and write while still in chains and while nothing in his physical line of sight indicated that he would ever be able to use those talents. Moral imagination is exactly what our political landscape is missing today. We settle for Pyrrhic victories because we can't see past this election cycle. We lose friends and family members because our sight does not go past November 5th. We trade insult for insult because we don't have the moral imagination to understand that human dignity is not scarce. We don't have to battle over it. We don't have to hoard it for ourselves. It's innate and abundant. Those with moral imagination refuse to lower the standard just because their opponents are wading in the mire and the muck. They refuse to lower the discourse just to win on one particular issue. They have the capacity to play by the rules even when they've taken a loss at the hands of foul play. That's Christian integrity. It takes moral imagination not to have an opposition-centered public witness in a polarized environment. It takes moral imagination to see what the moment is hiding from you. And in every generation, there are blind spots. There is something that's being hidden from you. In every community, you have blind spots, and that's why we need each other. Moral imagination prevents us from being enslaved by the moment. It enables us to participate in partisan politics without seeing the world through a partisan lens. It assures us that there's more than two ways to solve a problem. And it emboldens us to hold up timeless truths and Christian convictions even when the culture mocks us and threatens us. Because we know that there can be love in inconvenient truths, in things that don't affirm our self-perception. Faith produces moral imagination. And moral imagination affords us the vision necessary to build a better civic space, even when the prospects of doing so seem bleak and even irrational. It gives us the capacity to see and understand what we have in common with someone who is taunting or offending us. It forces us to recall that everyone has a story and everyone has a testimony, even when their anger and their prejudice hides it from us. The civil rights movement was an exercise in moral imagination. It was a demonstration of the vision and endurance necessary to build any great work of civic architecture. It was one of the most muscular displays of democracy shaping this country has ever witnessed. It didn't look past the present or overlook the present, but it also didn't limit itself to the present either. When civil rights freedom fighters sang songs about keeping their eyes on the prize, they were not talking about a prize that they could physically see. They were referring to a prize that had to be imagined through the lens of faith. They were describing an end goal that was not blurred by the myopia of the present. So that even when their eyes were swollen shut by batons and blinded by tear gas, they could still see the reward of a faithful and dignified public witness. And in this moment, every Christian sitting here tonight must decide what they will be. Is this election so important that we lay down our Christian compassion? That we lay down our biblical truth and our convictions? Or will we have the moral imagination to see past the moment and put our public witness before a simple win? God bless you. Thank you for having me.